My title this morning, I've never preached before, and I've never even thought about speaking about it publicly before. Confessions of a Recovering Progressive. And the description that Pastor Lou asked me for, progress is the de facto religion of the industrial world. But something has changed in America. What happens when we progressives lose the faith? And I've already been challenged before the service by someone who said, well, I'm a proud progressive. I'm never going to stop being a progressive. And depending upon what the word progressive means, that would qualify for me too. By saying I'm a recovering progressive, it doesn't mean I've gone to a Fox News watching. So my scripture reading, my inspirational reading this morning is from John Michael Greer. When you've driven down a blind alley and are sitting there with your bumper pressed up against a brick wall, the way forward, the only way to progress, starts by backing up. Revving the engine and hearing it labor and rattle as the gas gauge moves steadily towards that unwelcome letter E, or praying for a techno-miracle are not particularly useful responses. I grew up in 1958, or I was born in 1958, November of 1958, and my entire life until the last several years has essentially been within the context of not just a belief about progress, but an expectation, an assumption, just the way things are. Things would always be better for each generation. I fully expected that my children would have things better than I did. Certainly, it seemed that myself and my siblings had things better than my mother and my father in terms of wealth and in terms of opportunity and in terms of possibilities. Yeah, there were these nagging environmental issues that seemed to be causing problems, but we were getting a handle on a lot of those, it seemed. And certainly in the late 1960s and early 1970s, there were major environmental legislation put forth. And so we saw what seemed to be the continuation of progress. And even though I was raised Roman Catholic, I was the firstborn of 4 children in an Irish Catholic family, so I was expected to be a Catholic priest. Had a little bit too much testosterone to go that path. But nonetheless, even when I had a born-again experience in my late teenage years at 19, and then was involved in Pentecostal Christianity, so I experienced Catholicism and sort of the smells and the bells and the ritual, and I actually had a very positive experience as a Catholic. And then when I experienced Pentecostal, Bible-believing, Christianity, I read the Bible straight through twice. The Michael Dowd of 36 years ago would probably be standing outside the door here waiting for you to leave to give you a tract, those little pamphlets, and tell you what a heretic that guy in there is. And then pastored 3 United Church of Christ congregations with Allison, my wife. And during that time, we had 3 children, and all during that time, whether I was a Catholic or a conservative Assemblies of God Christian, or then more moderate or liberal Christian, progress and being a progressive was something that was a deeply held value for me all that time, because the way I interpreted that was larger circles of inclusion, larger circles of compassion, a commitment to justice where there was not justice. I was strongly, 2 of my heroes in my lifetime are Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., who were both all about correcting systemic injustice, legal evil. And then in 1988, I was introduced to Thomas Berry, who was a Roman Catholic monk. He called himself a geologian, not a theologian, a geologian. And he was one of the most significant ecological and evolutionary thinkers of the 20th century. And so that's where I learned the sacred history of the universe as our modern day creation story. And I pretty much went from being a supernaturalist to a naturalist, not exactly overnight, but within about a year in 1988. From that moment on, from 1988 on, I interpreted mythic language that sounds supernatural if you interpret it literally. I interpreted that as poetry, as metaphor of saying something about this one reality in which we live and move and have our being. And then how to live in a meaningful, inspiring, sacred way, in a way that was a blessing to myself, my family, the people around me, and that sort of thing. And so progressive values have been at the heart of my soul, my worldview, my life, throughout this whole time, whatever my religion. In fact, there was a time when Allison and I got into Native American spirituality and goddess, earth-honoring, nature-celebrating spirituality. And no matter what religious forms that we embraced, that I embraced, during that time, progress, the sense that things were getting better, and that things could probably continue to count on getting better, even if things were bad for me or for some of us or any one nation or whatever, that I could trust that things would continue to get better for our species because my worldview was essentially from the caves to now to the stars. I really had a Star Trek vision of the future. I grew up in the 1960s and 70s. Star Trek, Star Wars, this high technology, I remember where I was when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. I mean, this was a sacred experience for me. And then from about 2000 until 2012, December 12th or December 3rd of 2012, I was pretty much on this techno-optimism. I believe that technology was going to help us live in right relationship to reality, and technology was going to continue to drive progress, and there was this sense of almost inevitability that technology was a good thing by and large, that it was kind of like a tool that you could use a hammer to crush someone's skull or to build a house, and so tools were sort of neutral in and of themselves, and I interpreted technology that way. And then on December 3rd of 2012, Connie and I watched a TED Talk called Climate Change is Simple by David Roberts. And I wept watching it. I woke her up. We both watched it. We both wept. And that afternoon we bought a half a dozen major books on climate change, peak oil, sustainability, energy depletion, resource depletion. And I think my techno-optimism died that week. Not that I still don't think technology could play a role and will play a role, but I no longer have a Star Trek vision of the future. And in fact, in some ways, and this only came clear to me in the last 2 weeks, I think I've been in a low-grade funk. Not exactly a depression. I'm a pretty positive, upbeat, optimistic person. But I would occasionally dip down into despair, overwhelm, like, oh my God, what are we doing to the planet? What do we do to the future? And so I've spent the last 6 years, almost 6 years, it'll be 6 years in December, studying 20 or 30 or sometimes 40 hours a week, studying the rise and fall of civilizations, what things are like in contracting times. And one of the things that I learned was that it's not a linear progress. As I thought, it was sort of like hunter-gatherers, those were primitive people, and then the agricultural revolution. And that was a really good thing. And agriculture made things easier. And then later on, the industrial revolution, and that was even better. And industry and technology, and now we've got cooperation at the global scale. And I just assumed the linear progression of that. But what I've discovered is that actually we have evidence of, as I shared, I think last month, 32 civilizations, some would say quite a few more, but at least 32 civilizations that have become great, and then hubris, their own greatness, becomes their own undoing, and then they contract. And it usually takes half the amount of time to collapse, usually 1 or 2 centuries. It usually takes 2 to 4 centuries to become great. And we have lots of examples. We have at least 32 examples of that. And how we think about time and progress and our role in the body of life shifts. There is no one right way, I discovered, to think about time. For the 98% or 97 or 99%, depending upon where you put the beginning of humanity, if you start at 2.5 million years ago, Homo habilis, walking upright using stone tools, then that would be 2.5 million years ago. So 99% of human history, we lived sustainably. That is, we lived in a way that didn't diminish or degrade or destroy primary reality. That is, everything we depend upon for our existence. Soil, forest, water, climate, other animals, and so on. Plants. And then about 10,000 years ago, more or less, we started domesticating plants and animals. And even still during that time, there were cultures that lived more or less sustainably. That is, more or less in ways that they could live that way for thousands of years. But then once we started mining metals and creating metal tools and metal weapons, sort of this arms race built up where if you were a more powerful culture, you could take over other cultures, so they had to get powerful just to resist you, and it became this arm race that I believe now is probably inevitable. I no longer look back as I did at one time and say, oh, they were the right ones. I think in some ways this may have been so inevitable that any other species that had symbolic language, the way our brains work and our tool-making ability, probably would have gone the same route. That is, a huge section of time as sustainable, living in right relationship to primary reality, and then this period of increasing human-centeredness, which allows us to do agriculture and weapons and everything we start interpreting from a human-centered way. And so progress was, of course, interpreted for most cultures in their, as they became great. I mean, the primary source of energy for all cultures until just 300 years ago were human and animal muscle power, wind, sunlight, and trees. Trees, once we started creating axes and could cut down trees, trees became the primary fuel of civilizations. In fact, one book, I've just got some resources here that have made a difference, A Forest Journey, the story of wood and civilization. And this is a painful book because what you realize is that for about 5,000 or 6,000 years, trees were the main source of energy. And as there were more abundance of trees, societies got great, and their expansion and their numbers and big castles and all, big kind of monuments and stuff. And then after they had denuded the forests and the trees were thinner and scrawny or whatever, they try to take over other places. But at some point, it becomes economically non-viable to travel halfway across the world to bring trees, and the culture collapses. Or the soil washes into the Mediterranean or whatever. And so we see over and over and over again what's called ecological overshoot, where we have overshot the carrying capacity, that is the ability of the living world to provide resources and the ability of the living world to absorb our wastes. We've exceeded that in terms of our numbers and our impact, and then population declines, civilizations become less complex, more simple. We call that collapse, but it's not like overnight collapse. It's a stair step. It's what John Michael Greer in this book calls the long descent. It's a stair step. And it goes down, boom, That's the way virtually all civilizations have contracted. And so in the time where there's more than enough resources, a sense of progression, a sense of that use energy and use it more effectively than your neighbors. You will outcompete your neighbors. And so there is this drive and this sense of time that's all about progress, human-centeredness, and sort of a natural selection. Those people, those groups that had that worldview would have outcompeted others. So progress is inevitable. But we also have lots of evidence of cultures that are in 200, 300, 400, 500, or sometimes 1,000 or more years of decline. And during that time, if you're 200 years into decline, your sense of time isn't going to be progress. Your sense of time is, that was the golden age. Now things are worse, and things are going to continue getting worse. And one of the oldest Greek poets, Hesiod, talked about this. He was living 200, 250 years after collapse had started, and the whole sense of time was not progress, but decline. And then, of course, you add that to religious groups that believed that the garden was back there, things were all perfect, and then there was the fall and everything's declining. So we find different modes of thinking about time. For 99% of human history, there was no sense of time, because the thing is, if you're living sustainably and your people, your ancestors, going as back as far as memory and stories can tell, lived sustainably, then what they teach you in terms of how to live in right relationship to the living world is considered sacred knowledge. So it's not about change, it's about stability, it's about not change. So change was very slow. And change was not usually welcome for most of human history. It's only, as I said, when we start mining metals, when we have this competition and cultures warfare steps up, not like the skirmishes in hunter-gatherers, but full-scale, full-blown warfare, that we start seeing this notion of technological progression and sometimes moral progression, because in expanding economies, in expanding times, in expanding cultures, in expanding empires, and an empire is just a group of people that take advantage of resources on a much larger and bring the wealth to them. If America wasn't the leading empire, there would be somebody else. So empires aren't good or bad, they just are at this time in history. But during expanding times, liberal values tend to predominate. Because there's more than enough resources. There's more than enough carrying capacity. There's more than enough, there's a surplus of what's needed for human life to survive and thrive. And so as I became aware that in contracting societies, in contracting economies, in contracting civilizations, which if you look at human history, for the whole of human history, stasis, things being the same, is by far the norm. And there's probably about an equal time of expansion, progress, and decline. Both of those are there because that's what we see, depending upon when you're born and when your stories are told. So the most painful, it turns out, the most painful times in human history are those times where people are born in times of expansion, and then during their lifetime things shift to times of contraction, where we go from carrying capacity surplus to carrying capacity deficit. And conservative values tend to predominate in those times of contraction. And so we're seeing this resurgence of drawing the in-group, tightening up. In-group, out-group mentality becomes more pronounced in those conservative times. And so one of the sacred responsibilities of those of us who identify as progressives or liberals is to do what we can to hold on to the learnings and the values and the breakthroughs and the expansion of compassion, the expansion of inclusion that we have experienced, and in many cases we were on the forefront of, to ensure that those, as best we can, pass on into the future. Because this is what we also see. So that from an emotional standpoint, my life has gone from the assumption of progress to just the expectation, to these last 5.5 years of realizing, oh, we're not in progress. This book here, Techno-Fix, Why Technology Won't Save Us or in the Environment. Everybody refers to this book because it's like the Bible in understanding why human-centered technology can't save us, because human-centered technology is what's caused most of our problems. And so there's a time of humbling. It's a humility. And so this is what's happened to me, is that I've now gone to the place where I'm still a progressive in the sense that I'm committed to progressive values. I'm still a progressive if it means I am committed to ensuring that the best of what I've experienced in my lifetime, and not just my lifetime, the last 200 or 300 years, gets passed on. But I no longer believe that progress for humans is what it's all about. That if the entire life community doesn't progress, there is no progress for humans. As I shared a month ago, two of my great mentors, Thomas Berry, who I mentioned, and William Catton, who's the author of Overshoot. Connie and I consider this the most important book we've ever read in our lives. Both of us consider this. Many people consider this the most important book of the 20th century. And this is a quote. He says, human society is inextricably part of a global biotic community. And in that community, human dominance has had and is having self-destructive consequences. Thomas Berry said the most difficult transition to make is from a human-centered to a life-centered norm of progress. If there's to be any true progress, then the entire life community must progress. Any progress of the human at the expense of a larger life community must ultimately lead to a diminishment of human life itself. I read something just 2.5 weeks ago called The End of the Oceans. It was the most traumatic thing I've read in the last few years. I spiraled into a several-day-long depression. And I thought I was through that. I thought I had gone through and dealt with the grief and the anger and the bargaining, the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. I thought I had been dealing with denial and then anger and then bargaining and then depression. I'd come through to active hope, to finding the blessing and being in action. I thought I had gone through that process. Well, it turns out many of us have to go through that a few times. And so I find myself, my heart is more tender. I cry more easily, more frequently than I did prior to 6 years ago. I find myself more committed than ever to ensuring that the best of liberal progressive values pass on to the future. But I also know that for the rest of my lifetime, we're going to see a regression of some things that most of us in this room just sort of assumed would be the case throughout the course of our lifetime. And the good news, at least what I consider good news, is that there will be no shortage of opportunities to be a blessing. The things that give life meaning, the things that give my life meaning, are the same things that have given life meaning throughout history. Being a blessing to your kin, to your family, to your neighbors. Being a blessing to your enemy can be or somebody who doesn't like you can be a profound soul-nourishing thing. Finding ways to use your gifts, to use my gifts, in ways that can be of benefit to my community. These are the things that give life meaning. Interpreting life mythically. See, to interpret life mythically there's nothing magic, there's nothing woo-woo, there's nothing. It's basically just interpreting life personally. As I think I may have shared 3 or 4 years ago, or 3 or 5 years ago, we were 3 years ago and 5 years ago, is that Connie and I, one of the things we do to interpret life mythically is we personify almost everything. So God, for me, is not a supernatural being outside the universe. God's a personification of reality, a personification of the universe. An I-thou relationship. Our personification of North America is Nora. We say we've got an intimate, personal relationship to Nora. Oceana is the oceans. Jasmine is our relationship. As we personify a lot. And so I interpret that the universe is conspiring on my behalf. That's mythic. Is the universe conspiring on my behalf? I don't think so. I don't think the universe cares one way or the other about me individually. But if I act as if the universe is conspiring on my behalf, I love my life. And the people around me find me more tolerable or, welcome to be around. Allison and I used to, with our kids, we used to have these little memory verses. And one of them was, everything is perfect for my growth and learning. Now that's a useful belief. It's a mythic belief. Is everything perfect for my growth and learning? Well, only if you choose to interpret it that way. And Allison used to say, there's 2 ways of saying that. One is when things are going well, everything is perfect for my growth and learning. And then when things are not going well, everything is perfect for my growth and learning. Damn it. So one of the things that we can do, just in wrapping this up, practically, one of the things I agree with Connie, is that Dr. Lou, the pastor, is just so gifted at bringing practical things. So I invite you to interpret your life mythically. Like imagine that your whole life experience has brought you to this point in time in history. And it doesn't matter how young or how old you are, your gifts can be a blessing to your community. So be curious at how the universe, God, reality, whatever, nature, might be conspiring for you to be a blessing given your life experience, given your tragedies, given your everything. Again, it's just a mythic way, but we live better lives when we interpret Albert Einstein said the fundamental question that makes a difference in people's experience is the universe for us or against us? Well, again, it determines simply how you would choose to interpret it. I choose to interpret that the universe is for us. Not for us as individuals, because I think our species is going to go extinct just like every other species does at some point. And whether that happens in the next 50 years or the next 5 million years, it doesn't matter in terms of divine time, the universe time, that's just a little blip. I'll do a whole bunch on Tuesday night about this cosmic timeline and how having this bigger picture can give us inspiration to face the challenges. Because in the same way that coming to peace with our own mortality, coming to peace with our species' mortality can help us live life fully and love the life we live. So interpret life mythically. Find ways that your gifts can be a blessing to your community and to your friends and neighbors and whatever. And then finally, begin to downshift in some ways. One of the things, John Michael Greer, one of his books is called Collapse Now and Avoid the Rush. Because to the degree that we get used to using less energy, less stuff, less stimulation, those downshifting our lifestyles, we feel better about ourselves, and then when the manure hits the fan, then we're ready for it. In other words, we're not freaking out, so that when our neighbors and friends are challenged at the next economic downturn or whatever craziness our current administration gets us into, we then are in the place where we're not freaking out because we understand contraction, and then we can be a blessing to our neighbors and friends. And this church can be a leader in this community in terms of the fact that we're grounded in our best evidential, science-based understanding of everyone and everything, so that then when others are challenged by their worldview, we can be a contribution. And that, to my mind, is holy, holy work. And especially as we keep our hearts soft, as we're not afraid to cry, and as we're not afraid to be honest with ourselves in terms of our own anger or whatever, we get to really be whatever the universe, reality, God, goddess, whatever your name for this sacred process is, we get to be this, incarnate in this community.